The morning of October 31st, 1979, arrived in Central Texas without ceremony. Along a stretch of Interstate 35 near Georgetown, the day began as countless others had before it, with traffic moving steadily and the surrounding landscape appearing unchanged. The road cut through Williamson County as a piece of everyday infrastructure, familiar to commuters, truck drivers, and travelers passing through. Nothing about the location suggested that it would become fixed in memory, revisited repeatedly over the next 4 decades. At some point that morning, a body was discovered along a roadside drainage area near the interstate. The location was not hidden far from public view, but it was not a place where people lingered. It was shaped by runoff and concrete, part of the space created by road construction rather than by daily human activity. Law enforcement responded and began the standard procedures that followed such discoveries. The scene was documented. The area was secured. Initial observations were recorded. What investigators found was a young woman. She was estimated to be in her early 20s. She carried no identification. There were no personal documents, no wallet, no driver's license, no immediate clues that could establish who she was or where she came from. No nearby vehicle was clearly associated with her. No one came forward at the scene to claim recognition. In those first hours, the case presented itself as a death without context. The absence of a name immediately defined the investigation. Without identification, law enforcement could not notify family members or retrace recent movements. They could not look up employment records or contact friends. The usual starting points were unavailable. Instead, the investigation relied on what could be observed, measured, and preserved. Clothing was documented carefully. Personal items were cataloged. Biological material was collected according to the standards of the time. A ring found on the victim was noted as a potential identifying feature. Each detail was recorded because, in the absence of a name, every physical characteristic carried weight. Among those details, one stood out for its clarity. The woman was wearing orange socks. At the time, this was not a symbolic observation. It was practical. Investigators needed a way to reference the case in reports and communication. Without a name or known background, the case required a label. The orange socks provided one. They were distinct enough to serve that function, and they became the simplest way to distinguish this unidentified woman from other cases. In internal records and later in public references, the woman began to be described as Orange Socks. The label was not intended to define her. It was a placeholder, a temporary solution until her identity could be established. In the days following the discovery, there was every expectation that someone would recognize her description, that a missing person report would surface, or that her identity would soon be confirmed. That did not happen. Days passed, then weeks. The usual methods of identification were pursued. Fingerprints were taken and compared. Dental records were examined. Descriptions were circulated. None of these efforts produced a match. No existing missing person report aligned with the information investigators had. The absence of identification was not due to a single failure, but to a series of limits imposed by the era and by the available records. In 1979, systems for sharing information across jurisdictions were fragmented. Databases were not centralized. Communication relied heavily on physical records and regional cooperation. If a person was not reported missing, or if the report existed outside the networks being checked, the connection could be missed entirely. This was not uncommon, but it carried serious consequences. As the investigation continued, the case was classified as a homicide. That determination shaped how evidence was handled and preserved. It also underscored the seriousness of the situation. A young woman had lost her life, and no one knew who she was. The label Orange Socks remained in use as the investigation moved forward. Over time, it appeared in case files, summaries, and later in media references. What had begun as a temporary identifier slowly hardened into a fixed name. The object replaced the person in official language. This transformation happened quietly. There was no moment when the woman ceased to be seen as an individual and became a label. It occurred through repetition and necessity. Each report that used the term reinforced it. Each year that passed without identification made it more permanent. The road near Georgetown returned to its routine. Traffic continued. The drainage area remained part of the landscape, unnoticed by most who passed by. The case, however, did not disappear. It entered a different phase, one defined not by active discovery, but by waiting. The central question formed without urgency, but with persistence. Who was this woman, and how did she come to be here unnamed? The orange socks remained at the center of that question. They were the one detail that endured without change. Other aspects of the case would be debated, revisited, or reconsidered over time. The socks did not shift. They were present at the beginning and would remain part of the case record for decades. In the broader context of unidentified victims, this was not an isolated situation. Across the country, similar cases existed, each defined by a few physical details and a lack of connection to known identities. What made this case notable was not immediately apparent in 1979. That significance would only become clear much later. For now, the investigation continued within its constraints. Evidence was preserved. Reports were filed. The expectation of identification slowly faded as time passed. The label persisted because it had to. Without it, there was nothing to call the case at all. The woman found near Interstate 35 was not yet Deborah Louise Jackson in any official sense. She was Orange Socks, an identifier born out of necessity, carrying no story of its own. The object stood in for a life that had not yet been reclaimed by name. As the years moved forward, this object would take on a different weight. It would become the thread that connected the discovery in 1979 to developments decades later. At the start, though, it was simply what investigators had. The case entered the record in that form, waiting for something that could replace a description with an identity. Before the case acquired a name made from an object, before it entered records as an unidentified homicide, there was a person whose life existed apart from any investigation. That life did not announce itself as unusual, and it did not leave behind an extensive public record. What remains is partial, restrained by what can be verified, and defined as much by absence as by fact. Deborah Louise Jackson was born and raised in Texas. Verified records place her upbringing in Abilene, a city that, like many others in the state, sits at the intersection of long highways and quiet neighborhoods. It was a place defined by routine and familiarity, not by transience. For the years she lived there, Deborah was known within a family context that did not anticipate disappearance or long silence. Around 1977, Deborah left her family's home. This departure was not documented as a crisis. There is no indication in the available records that it was sudden or alarming. It aligns with a pattern common to many young adults of the period, particularly in a state as geographically large as Texas. People moved for work. They traveled between towns. They did not always leave detailed traces behind. After leaving Abilene, Deborah traveled and worked in different parts of Texas. Confirmed information places her in Amarillo in 1978. Beyond that, details become sparse. There are references to other communities, but they do not form a continuous, verifiable timeline. What can be said with certainty is that she remained within the state and that her movements were not isolated to a single location. This mobility is important not because it suggests instability, but because it explains later gaps. When a person moves frequently, their connections become distributed. Records are scattered across jurisdictions, employers change, addresses shift. Without centralized systems to track these changes, a person can move through multiple places without leaving a unified trail. There is no public documentation of Deborah's daily routines during this period. No confirmed accounts of close companions, long-term plans, or specific goals have been preserved in the case materials. This absence limits how her story can be told. It prevents speculation, It requires restraint. What is known is that contact with her family ended at some point after she left Abilene. The timing of that last contact is not precisely established in public records. There is no verified account of a final conversation or a clear moment when communication stopped. The silence did not arrive with a clear boundary. It settled gradually, without an immediate trigger. Importantly, there is no indication that Deborah was reported missing during this period. This fact would later shape the investigation in ways that were not immediately apparent. At the time, the absence of a missing person report did not signal danger. Adults often lost touch with family for extended periods, especially when traveling for work. Silence alone did not prompt formal action. Without a missing person report, no official record existed that could later be matched against unidentified remains. The systems relied on those reports as entry points. If a name was never entered, there was nothing to connect. This administrative gap was not unique to Deborah's case. It reflected the limitations of the era. Reporting required certainty and concern that rose above everyday absence. In many families, waiting was the default response. Time passed. Assumptions were made. The lack of immediate alarm would later become a defining factor. As the years moved forward, Deborah's life continued beyond the reach of documented records. Whatever routines she established, whatever relationships she formed, they were not preserved in a way that survived into the investigation. This does not suggest that they did not exist. It only means they were not captured. When her body was discovered in 1979, none of this information was available to investigators. They did not know her name. They did not know where she had lived before. They did not know where she had been working or who might have seen her last. The person they encountered at the roadside was disconnected from the life that had preceded that moment. The contrast is sharp but quiet. On one side is a young woman who left home, traveled, and lived independently within Texas. On the other is an unidentified victim described only by physical characteristics and clothing. The transition between those two states is undocumented. This absence complicates narrative structure. It resists interpretation. There is no confirmed turning point, no recorded event that marks the shift from ordinary movement to fatal outcome. The lack of such a marker forces the story to remain grounded in what is verifiable. Deborah's life before 1979 cannot be framed as a prelude to tragedy. There is no factual basis for that. It stands on its own as a life that moved forward until it intersected with a point where records stopped. In later years, after her identity was restored, some details of her background became clearer in outline. The name returned. The place of origin was confirmed. The age at death was established as 23. These facts provided a foundation, but they did not reconstruct a full portrait. What they did accomplish was essential. They reconnected the unidentified case to a real person. They established that the woman found near Interstate 35 had a history that extended beyond the investigation. She was not created by the case. She existed before it. This understanding reframes the label that had been used for decades. The orange socks, which would later define the case publicly, were never part of Deborah's identity in life. They were incidental. They became significant only because everything else was missing. In the absence of detailed personal records, it is tempting to search for meaning in the limited facts that remain. The structure of this story does not allow that. The facts do not support interpretation beyond acknowledgement. Deborah lived, moved, and then disappeared from record. That is the extent of what can be stated without speculation. Her life before Georgetown remains largely unobserved, not because it was empty, but because it was undocumented. The investigation would later struggle with that absence, but at this stage, it existed without context, waiting to be connected to something that had not yet been identified. The most difficult part of this case is not what investigators found, but what they could never clearly define. Between Deborah Louise Jackson leaving her family's home in Abilene and the discovery of her body near Interstate 35, there is no complete, verified timeline. That absence shapes everything that follows. It limits conclusions, constrains language, and forces the narrative to remain grounded in uncertainty. There is no confirmed last sighting of Deborah. No witness has come forward with a documented account placing her at a specific location, on a specific date shortly before her death. No official record captures her final movements. The available facts do not support a detailed reconstruction of her last day or night, and they do not allow investigators or historians to identify a clear moment when her path shifted toward the roadside near Georgetown. What is known is that Deborah had been traveling and working within Texas. Her presence in Amarillo in 1978 is confirmed. Beyond that, her movements remain undefined. Texas is a large state, connected by long highways that facilitate movement but do not record it. In the late 1970s, there were no digital systems tracking travel, employment changes, or short-term housing. A person could move between cities, take temporary work, and interact with others without leaving a durable record. This reality is essential to understanding the gap in Deborah's timeline. It is not evidence of concealment or secrecy. It reflects how ordinary movement functioned at the time. Many people lived in ways that were minimally documented. When contact with family ended, it did not automatically signal danger. Silence could stretch for months or longer without prompting immediate concern. Because Deborah was not reported missing, there was no official starting point for an investigation into her disappearance. Law enforcement did not receive a report noting her last known location, clothing, or contacts. No alert was circulated. No timeline was constructed while details were still fresh. By the time her body was discovered, whatever informal knowledge existed about her recent movements had not been preserved in any official way. The discovery itself provides the first fixed point in the case. On October 31, 1979, Deborah's body was found along a roadside drainage area near Interstate 35 in Williamson County. This location anchors the timeline. Everything before it is uncertain. Everything after it is documented. Investigators could determine where she was found, but not how she arrived there. The roadside setting suggests proximity to a major transportation route, but that information alone does not narrow the possibilities. Interstate highways are used by local drivers, long-distance travelers, and commercial traffic. They connect rural and urban areas without distinction. Presence near a highway does not establish origin or destination. There is no confirmed evidence placing Deborah in Georgetown or Williamson County before her death. No employment records, housing information, or witness statements link her to the area. The available facts do not support a conclusion that she lived there, worked there, or intended to be there. The location is significant only because it is where she was found. This distinction matters. Without evidence of her presence in the area before her death, investigators cannot build a local timeline. They cannot identify people who might have known her there or places she might have visited. The case does not unfold around a familiar setting with known routines. It emerges abruptly at the point of discovery. The absence of a clear timeline also limits how the case can be narrated. There is no factual basis for describing her final hours, her route, or her state of mind. Those details remain outside the record. Responsible retelling requires acknowledging that limitation rather than attempting to fill it. In this space of uncertainty, one detail remains constant. The orange socks Deborah was wearing when she was found do not explain how she arrived at that location, but they do anchor the case. They are the one element that does not shift as theories change or records are revisited. In a timeline defined by gaps, they serve as a fixed reference point. This is not because the socks carry inherent meaning. They are ordinary. Their significance comes entirely from context. When nothing else can be traced backward, the object present at discovery becomes the earliest point of reference available to investigators. The lack of a defined disappearance timeline also affected the investigation that followed. Without knowing when Deborah was last seen, law enforcement could not establish a narrow window for events. They could not correlate her disappearance with specific incidents, reports, or movements in the area. The absence of time markers made it difficult to rule possibilities in or out. This uncertainty extended to forensic analysis. While investigators could estimate certain aspects related to the condition of the body, the public record does not provide a precise timeframe that would allow a detailed reconstruction of when Deborah S. life ended relative to her discovery. As a result, the case could not be anchored to a specific series of events. For the community, the case did not unfold as a disappearance followed by a search. It appeared fully formed at the moment of discovery. There was no period of public concern about a missing person, no flyers, no appeals for information tied to a name. The unidentified woman entered the public record without a preceding narrative. This abrupt appearance contributed to the case's long-term ambiguity. When a person disappears and is later found, there's often a bridge of memory connecting those 2 points. In this case, that bridge did not exist. The community encountered the case only after Deborah's life had already ended. Over time, investigators and researchers would revisit the question of her final movements. Each time, they encountered the same limitation. Without new evidence, the gap remained. It could not be closed through inference alone. The highway context reinforces this reality. Roads are spaces of transition. They are designed for movement, not for memory. People pass through them without leaving records of their presence. When something happens along a highway, it can be difficult to trace its origins precisely because the space itself does not retain history. In Deborah's case, the highway does not function as a setting for a sequence of events. It functions as a boundary. On one side of that boundary is a life that moved through Texas without comprehensive documentation. On the other side is a documented death that entered official records. The moment of crossing is unrecorded. This gap is not an oversight that can be corrected with hindsight. It is a structural absence rooted in how information was collected and preserved at the time. Acknowledging that absence is part of maintaining factual integrity. As years passed and the case remained unresolved, the undefined period before discovery took on a quiet weight. It represented not only missing information, but also the limits of what could be known. Even after Deborah's identity was restored decades later, this portion of her story remained unchanged. Identification provided a name, a place of origin, and a clearer understanding of her background. It did not retroactively create a disappearance timeline. The facts did not expand backward in time. They stopped where they had always stopped. This reality underscores the importance of the golden thread in the narrative. The orange socks do not illuminate the gap, but they mark its edge. They are present at the first documented moment in the case. Everything before them fades into uncertainty. In many investigations, unanswered questions create space for speculation. This case resists that tendency. The structure of the facts does not support elaboration. The responsible approach is to leave the gap intact. The absence of a confirmed disappearance timeline is not a failure of storytelling. It is a defining characteristic of the case. It shapes how the investigation unfolded and why it remained unresolved for so long. It explains why Deborah's identity could be lost even though she lived within a populated state and traveled through ordinary places. The day of discovery stands alone. It is the first moment that can be described with precision. Everything before it exists without timestamps, locations, or witnesses. That imbalance between the known and the unknown is central to understanding the case. As the investigation moved forward, this gap would continue to influence every decision. Without a clear starting point, investigators had to work from the middle outward, relying on physical evidence rather than narrative continuity. The orange socks remained at the center of that effort, not because they explained anything, but because they were all that could be consistently referenced. In the absence of a disappearance timeline, the case asks a restrained question. Not what happened in detail, but how a person could move through ordinary spaces and leave so little behind that their identity vanished entirely. By the time investigators began working the case in earnest, they were already constrained by a central absence. The woman found near Interstate 35 had no name, no documents, and no immediate link to any known missing person. From the beginning, the investigation unfolded without the basic framework that normally guides early decisions. Law enforcement classified the death as a homicide. That determination set the procedural tone and dictated how evidence would be handled. The scene near the roadside drainage area was documented, and the surrounding environment was examined in a manner consistent with investigative standards of the late 1970s. The location itself offered limited context. It was adjacent to a major highway, a place defined by transit rather than by residents or routine activity. Evidence collection focused on what was physically present. Clothing was cataloged carefully, including the orange socks that would later define the case publicly. Personal items were inventoried. A ring found on the victim was noted as a potential identifying feature. Biological material was collected and preserved using the methods available at the time. Each item was recorded because, without a name, physical evidence became the only available foundation. Investigators attempted identification through standard channels. Fingerprints were taken and compared against existing records. Dental information was examined in hopes of finding a match. These efforts depended on the presence of corresponding records elsewhere. If the victim's fingerprints or dental records were not on file, or if they existed outside the systems being checked, the comparison would yield nothing. That is what happened here. No match was found through fingerprint analysis. Dental records did not lead to an identification. These results did not indicate an error in procedure. They reflected the limits of the available databases and the absence of a reported disappearance connected to the victim. The lack of a missing person report was a critical obstacle. Investigations into unidentified deaths rely heavily on cross-referencing reported disappearances. When no report exists, there is no formal description to compare against physical findings. In this case, the absence of such a report meant investigators were working in isolation from any known personal history. Information was shared through the channels available at the time. Descriptions of the victim were circulated to other jurisdictions. Physical characteristics and clothing details were included. These communications were intended to prompt recognition from agencies that might have received a relevant missing person report. Despite these efforts, no connection emerged. As days passed without identification, the investigation shifted from active pursuit to maintenance. Evidence was preserved, records were organized. The case remained open, but momentum slowed. Without new information, investigators could not advance beyond the initial steps. During this period, the label "Orange Socks" became more firmly embedded in the case file. It appeared in internal documentation and later in external references. The label was not intended to replace a name permanently. It was a practical solution to an immediate problem. Over time, however, it became the primary way the case was discussed. This shift had subtle consequences. A case identified by a nickname rather than a name can become abstract. It risks being perceived as a set of facts rather than a person's life. Investigators were aware of this tension, but without identification, there was no alternative. The early investigation did not produce witnesses who could place the victim in the area prior to her death. No one came forward with a documented account of seeing her recently. There were no verified sightings that could anchor her presence to a specific location or timeframe before discovery. This absence limited the ability to build a local investigative focus. Without witnesses or a timeline, investigators could not narrow the field of inquiry. They could not determine where she had been staying, who she had interacted with, or what circumstances might have led her to the roadside. The case lacked direction not because of oversight, but because of missing inputs. As weeks turned into months, the investigation entered a holding pattern. The homicide classification remained, but active leads were exhausted. The case did not close immediately. Instead, it lingered in an unresolved state, awaiting information that did not arrive. Eventually, a development appeared to provide resolution. Henry Lee Lucas, a man who confessed to numerous murders across several states, became associated with the case. His confession offered what the investigation had lacked: an explanation. In the context of the time, this was significant. Confessions were often viewed as decisive, particularly when they aligned with unsolved cases. The association of Lucas with the case led to a form of closure. Official records reflected this development, and the case was effectively considered resolved. This resolution did not answer every question, but it provided an endpoint within the investigative process. Over time, however, doubts emerged. Lucas's pattern of confessions came under scrutiny in many cases, including this one. Reviews identified inconsistencies between his statements and known facts. In some instances, evidence suggested he could not have been present at the relevant times or locations. These doubts did not immediately reopen the investigation. Once a case is marked as resolved, especially through a confession, the threshold for revisiting it is high. Resources are limited, and attention shifts to cases without any resolution at all. As a result, the early investigative phase ended in a state of partial closure. The case was no longer actively pursued, but it was not fully explained. The identification of a suspect did not restore the victim's name or connect her to a broader personal history. The orange socks remained unchanged in their role. They continued to be part of the case file, unaffected by shifts in investigative conclusions. While theories evolved and confessions were questioned, the physical evidence remained static. The initial investigation thus concluded with several unresolved elements. The victim's identity was still unknown. The timeline before discovery was still undefined. The confession that appeared to resolve the case would later be regarded with skepticism. What remained was a preserved record and a case that had not been fully understood. This phase of the investigation illustrates how cases can move toward closure without achieving clarity. Administrative resolution does not always align with factual certainty. In this instance, the absence of a name and a reliable timeline made definitive conclusions difficult. For years afterward, the case would exist in this suspended state. It was neither actively investigated nor fully forgotten. Evidence remained stored. Records remained accessible. The groundwork laid during the initial investigation would later become important, not because it solved the case, but because it preserved the possibility of future inquiry. The early investigators worked within the tools and knowledge available to them. Their efforts were constrained by structural limits rather than by lack of attention. Understanding those limits is essential to understanding why the case remained unresolved for so long. By the early 1980s, the case of the unidentified woman found near Interstate 35 had reached a point of exhaustion. Investigators had preserved evidence, circulated descriptions, and attempted identification through every available channel. None of it had produced a name. The case existed in records, but without momentum. It was unresolved, and unresolved cases exert pressure on investigative systems that are designed to move forward. It was in this context that Henry Lee Lucas entered the narrative. Lucas was already known to law enforcement as a man who confessed to a large number of murders across multiple states. His confessions were extensive, often detailed, and they seemed to offer answers to cases that had none. For agencies holding unsolved homicides, these confessions represented a potential endpoint. They promised clarity in situations defined by uncertainty. At some point, Lucas confessed to killing the woman known as Orange Socks. This confession connected him to the case and provided what investigators had not been able to establish on their own: an explanation. The confession aligned with a broader pattern in which Lucas claimed responsibility for numerous unsolved crimes, many involving victims he had never been formally linked to through physical evidence. In the context of the time, this mattered. Confessions were treated as significant, especially when they came from an individual already implicated in violent crimes. The legal system relied heavily on admissions of guilt, and the threshold for accepting a confession was lower than it would later become. When Lucas named himself as responsible, the case gained a suspect where none had existed before. This development altered the status of the investigation. The case, which had been suspended in uncertainty, could now be marked as resolved in an administrative sense. Records reflected this shift. The narrative moved from open-ended inquiry to concluded explanation. For years, this confession stood as the accepted resolution. The case did not receive further active investigation. Evidence remained stored, but it was not revisited with urgency. The identification of a perpetrator reduced the pressure to continue searching for alternative explanations. However, this resolution carried structural weaknesses that were not immediately addressed. Over time, Lucas's confessions in many cases came under scrutiny. Investigators, journalists, and legal advocates began to examine the reliability of his statements. Patterns emerged that raised concerns. Lucas had confessed to crimes committed in places where evidence suggested he could not have been present. In some cases, his accounts conflicted with established timelines or physical facts. These broader concerns extended to the Orange Socks case. Subsequent reviews identified inconsistencies between Lucas's confession and what was known about the case. Some analyses suggested that he may not have been in the relevant area at the relevant time. Others noted the lack of corroborating physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. The confession, once seen as definitive, became questionable. Despite these doubts, the case did not immediately reopen. Once a case is considered solved, especially through a confession, institutional inertia sets in. Resources are finite. Investigators prioritize cases without any resolution over those with answers, even if those answers are imperfect. This is how false closure operates. It does not require certainty. It requires plausibility and acceptance. Once those are in place, the investigative process often moves on. In the Orange Socks case, the confession did not provide what the investigation had lacked from the beginning. It did not identify the victim. It did not reconstruct her movements. It did not connect her to a community or a family. It addressed only the question of responsibility, and even that answer rested on unstable ground. The Orange Socks themselves remained unchanged in significance during this period. They continued to serve as the case's primary identifier. While a suspect's name had been attached, the victim still had none. The object remained the most consistent element in the record. This imbalance is important. In many resolved cases, identification of a perpetrator brings with it a fuller understanding of the victim's life. In this case, the confession did not lead to that outcome. The case remained asymmetrical. A suspect's name was known, but the victim's identity was not. Over time, skepticism surrounding Lucas's confessions grew stronger. High-profile reviews of his cases revealed systemic issues in how his statements had been obtained and accepted. Law enforcement agencies began to re-examine the assumption that his confessions could be taken at face value. For the Orange Socks case, this created a quiet contradiction. Official records reflected closure, but the underlying facts did not fully support it. The case existed in a state where it was both solved and unresolved at the same time. This contradiction did not generate immediate action. Instead, it settled into the background. The case remained largely inactive, neither fully reopened nor fully set aside. Evidence stayed preserved. Files stayed accessible. But there was no active push to resolve the remaining questions. The consequences of this period were long-lasting. Because the case was considered closed, it did not benefit from early developments in forensic science that might otherwise have been applied sooner. DNA technology advanced through the 1980s and 1990s, but the incentive to retest evidence was low for cases marked as resolved. False closure delayed progress without erasing uncertainty. It allowed the case to persist in records without evolving. The unanswered questions about the victim's identity and final movements remained unanswered, but they were no longer driving investigation. The role of the Orange Socks shifted subtly during this time. They were no longer the sole marker of an open mystery. Instead, they became a relic of an earlier phase of the case. The label remained, but its urgency diminished as the narrative centered on the confession rather than the unidentified victim. This shift illustrates how investigative focus can change the meaning of evidence without altering the evidence itself. The socks did not gain or lose factual significance. What changed was how they were perceived within the broader story of the case. For decades, this state of partial resolution persisted. The confession stood as the official answer, even as doubt circulated quietly in the background. The case did not attract sustained public attention. It remained one among many entries in historical records, its unresolved elements overshadowed by the appearance of closure. When later investigators and researchers revisited the case, they encountered this layered history. They found evidence preserved from the original investigation, records reflecting a confession-based resolution, and subsequent analyses questioning that resolution. Untangling these layers required revisiting assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. This is the central turning point in the narrative. The confession did not solve the case. It altered its trajectory. It shifted the case from open uncertainty to closed ambiguity. That shift delayed the eventual restoration of the victim's identity and postponed the application of tools that would later prove decisive. The golden thread of the case remains visible here. The orange socks, unchanged and unremarked upon for years, outlasted the confession. They remained part of the record through every reinterpretation. When the suspect's role was questioned, the object remained. When the case grew quiet, the object remained. It neither confirmed nor contradicted the confession. It simply persisted. False leads often appear convincing because they offer narrative completeness. They supply beginnings, middles, and ends. In this case, the confession provided an ending without a beginning. It closed a file without opening a life. Understanding this period requires restraint. It is not a story of deception uncovered through dramatic reversal. It is a story of administrative decisions, evolving standards, and the slow realization that certainty had been assumed rather than established. For the family of Deborah Louise Jackson, this period passed without resolution or recognition. They did not know where she was or what had happened to her. The confession did not reach them as closure because her identity was still unknown. The case's apparent resolution existed only within institutional records. For the community, the case faded from view. Without an ongoing search or a named victim, there was little to hold public attention. The narrative ended quietly, without ceremony or reflection. This false ending would later be undone, not by confession or witness testimony, but by science. At this stage, however, the case remained suspended between certainty and doubt, shaped by a conclusion that did not withstand scrutiny. The red herring of the confession did not introduce chaos. It introduced stillness. It allowed the case to stop moving forward while leaving its most important questions unanswered.
By the mid-1980s, the case had entered a long period of stillness. The official record showed a homicide that had been resolved through a confession, even as questions quietly remained. With that administrative closure in place, there was no active investigation pushing forward. The case existed, but it did not move. For years, evidence remained preserved rather than examined. Physical items collected in 1979 were stored according to protocol. Files were maintained. Nothing was discarded, but nothing new was added. The case did not disappear, yet it receded into the background of law enforcement priorities. This period coincided with significant changes in forensic science, but those changes unfolded gradually. In the 1980s and 1990s, DNA analysis began to emerge as a tool for criminal investigations. Early applications were limited and expensive. The technology was not immediately accessible to every agency, and it was most often applied to active cases or those without any resolution at all. Because the Orange Socks case was officially closed, it did not benefit from these early advances. There was little incentive to revisit evidence from a case that already had a named perpetrator, even one whose confession was increasingly questioned in other contexts. The logic of triage prevailed. Resources were directed toward cases that lacked any explanation rather than those with uncertain ones. As decades passed, the case remained largely unchanged in public view. It appeared occasionally in lists of unidentified victims or historical summaries of unresolved homicides, often still referenced by the same object-based label. The name Deborah Louise Jackson was not yet attached to the record. The Orange Socks continued to function as the case's primary identifier. For Deborah's family, this period unfolded without information or resolution. Without knowing where she was or what had happened to her, there was no closure. The absence that had begun when contact ended in the late 1970s continued into the following decades. Time passed, but the unanswered questions remained. Within the community, memory faded. The discovery near Interstate 35 did not remain part of daily conversation. New events, new cases, and new concerns took precedence. The roadside where Deborah was found returned fully to its ordinary role, unmarked and unremarked upon by most who passed it. The case's persistence during this time depended less on attention than on preservation. Records were kept, evidence was stored. Even as the case remained inactive, it was not lost. This quiet maintenance would later prove essential. In the broader landscape of criminal justice, attitudes toward confessions began to shift. Reviews of Henry Lee Lucas's cases exposed systemic problems. Investigators and courts became more cautious about accepting confessions without corroborating evidence. This re-evaluation affected many cases linked to Lucas, but it did not immediately translate into action for every one of them. The Orange Socks case occupied an ambiguous position. Doubts about the confession were known in general terms, but there was no specific trigger to reopen the investigation. Without new evidence or a formal request, the case remained in its suspended state. As technology continued to evolve, forensic DNA databases expanded. Genetic genealogy emerged as a method capable of identifying unknown individuals through distant relatives. This approach was not part of mainstream investigations until much later. For years, it existed as a possibility rather than a standard practice. During this time, the case's dual timeline became more pronounced. On one track, the historical record remained fixed at 1979 and the early 1980s, defined by discovery, investigation, and force closure. On the other, the world moved forward, developing tools that could potentially answer questions the original investigation could not. Public interest in cold cases grew slowly. Media attention to unidentified victims increased, often driven by advances in technology and renewed advocacy for cases long considered unsolvable. The Orange Socks case appeared intermittently in this context, usually framed as a mystery defined by time rather than by new developments. Despite these shifts, the case did not immediately change. Evidence was not re-examined. Identification remained out of reach. The passage of time did not, on its own, generate answers. What this period represents is not inactivity in the sense of neglect, but dormancy. The case waited for conditions that did not yet exist. It required both technological capability and institutional willingness to revisit assumptions that had been in place for decades. The Orange Socks remained part of the case file throughout this time. They were no longer the focus of active inquiry, but they were still present in descriptions and summaries. The object endured as a reminder of how the case had been defined in the absence of a name. This long interval also reshaped the emotional dimensions of the case. As years turned into decades, the possibility of resolution can feel increasingly remote. For families of unidentified victims, time does not soften uncertainty, it extends it. By the early 2000s, the case had existed in this dormant state for more than 20 years. New generations of investigators inherited records created by their predecessors. The original context faded, replaced by documentation that captured decisions but not always the reasoning behind them. The eventual reopening of the case would require more than curiosity. It would require a convergence of factors, preserved evidence, improved technology, and a willingness to question prior conclusions. During these cold case years, those elements slowly aligned, even if no one could yet see the outcome. The silence of this period is a defining feature. It explains why identification took so long and why the breakthrough, when it came, felt abrupt. Decades of inactivity created the conditions for a sudden shift once the right tools were applied. In the absence of new information, the case remained unchanged. The victim was still unnamed. The timeline before discovery was still undefined. The confession still occupied an uncertain place in the record. Everything that mattered remained unresolved. Yet, the case endured. Not because it was actively pursued, but because it was carefully kept. That distinction is subtle, but important. Preservation allowed the past to remain accessible to the future. Without it, later advances would have had nothing to work with. As the cold case years continued, the possibility of identification existed only in theory. The practical means to achieve it had not yet been fully realized. The case waited, suspended between what was known and what might someday be discovered.
When the case moved again after decades of stillness, it did not do so because of a confession, a witness, or a recovered memory. It moved because the tools available to investigators had changed. What had once been an unidentified homicide defined by the absence of a name became, slowly and methodically, a case that could be revisited through evidence that had been preserved but never fully understood. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, forensic science had entered a different phase. DNA analysis was no longer limited to direct comparisons against criminal databases. Genetic genealogy made it possible to identify unknown individuals by tracing familial connections across generations. This approach did not require a prior arrest record or a missing person report. It relied instead on biological material and the expanding availability of genealogical data. For the Orange Socks case, this shift was decisive. Biological evidence collected in 1979 had been preserved. For decades, it had remained dormant, not because it was unimportant, but because the technology required to fully interpret it did not yet exist. Once modern DNA testing methods became available, that evidence could finally be re-examined with new purpose. The case was reopened with a specific goal: identification of the victim. Not reassessment of guilt, not reconstruction of events. The first priority was to restore a name to the woman who had been known only by a clothing detail for nearly 40 years. This decision reflected a broader change in how cold cases were approached. Identity itself was recognized as a form of resolution, even when other questions remained unanswered. Knowing who a person was mattered, regardless of whether every aspect of the crime could be explained. Modern DNA analysis was applied to the preserved biological material. This process required careful handling and verification. Results were not immediate. Genetic genealogy involves building family trees from partial matches, tracing connections through distant relatives, and narrowing possibilities through systematic elimination. Investigators and forensic specialists worked within this framework, following leads generated by genetic similarities rather than eyewitness accounts or physical descriptions. The work was technical and incremental. Each step reduced uncertainty, but did not guarantee an answer. As the genealogical analysis progressed, potential family connections emerged. These connections pointed toward relatives who were unaware that a family member might be linked to an unidentified homicide. Contacting them required caution and sensitivity. The goal was confirmation, not speculation. At the same time, an updated forensic reconstruction was released publicly. This reconstruction was not intended to dramatize the case. Its purpose was practical. It offered a visual reference that could prompt recognition from those who might have known the victim. For the first time, the case presented an image that attempted to reflect the woman's appearance rather than the objects she carried. This shift was significant. It moved the focus away from the orange socks and toward the person who had worn them. Family members recognized the image. This recognition did not stand alone. It was followed by DNA confirmation. Genetic comparisons established a match between the unidentified victim and living relatives. The process concluded with a verified identification. In 2019, nearly 40 years after her body was discovered near Interstate 35, the woman known publicly as Orange Socks was officially identified as Deborah Louise Jackson. The impact of this moment was structural rather than dramatic. The case did not transform overnight. It did not suddenly answer every unresolved question. What it did accomplish was foundational. It restored Deborah's name to the record. It connected the unidentified remains to a documented life. For the first time since 1979, the case could be described using a full identity rather than a placeholder. This identification also altered the dual timeline that had defined the narrative. On one track, there was the historical sequence of discovery, investigation, false closure, and dormancy. On the other, there was Deborah's life, which had existed independently of the case. The identification brought those two timelines into alignment. The golden thread of the case, the Orange Socks, reached a quiet resolution here. For decades, they had served as the only consistent identifier. They were the object through which the case had been known and remembered. Once Deborah's identity was confirmed, their role changed. They did not disappear from the record. They did not lose their factual significance. But they no longer carried the weight of identity. The object that had once stood in for a name was no longer required to do so. This shift is subtle but profound. It represents a transition from abstraction to personhood. The case was no longer about an unidentified woman defined by clothing. It was about Deborah Louise Jackson, a person with a place of origin, a family, and a life that predated the crime. The identification also reframed earlier investigative conclusions. The confession that had once closed the case became secondary. While questions about responsibility remained, the primary achievement of this phase was not the assignment of guilt. It was the correction of anonymity. This distinction matters. Many cold cases remain unresolved because they lack evidence capable of supporting prosecution. Identification does not require that level of proof. It requires only enough evidence to establish who the victim was. In this case, that threshold was met. For Deborah's family, the identification provided long-delayed answers. It did not reconstruct her final days or explain how she came to be found near Georgetown. It did not resolve every uncertainty. What it did offer was clarity about what had happened to her in the most fundamental sense. She had been found. She had not simply vanished without explanation. The identification also corrected the historical record. For decades, Deborah's case had existed as an entry defined by absence. With her name restored, it could be recontextualized. Her background, however limited by surviving records, could now be acknowledged. From an investigative standpoint, the identification validated the decision to preserve evidence. It demonstrated that careful maintenance, even during long periods of inactivity, can enable future breakthroughs. The success of genetic genealogy depended entirely on the existence of preserved biological material. The case's reawakening also reflected broader trends in cold case investigation. Similar methods were being applied across the country, leading to the identification of victims who had remained unnamed for decades. Deborah's case became part of that larger movement. Importantly, the identification did not immediately resolve questions about the homicide itself. The case did not reopen in a way that produced new suspects or definitive conclusions about responsibility. The confession by Henry Lee Lucas remained disputed. No new perpetrator was publicly named. This limitation underscores the difference between identity and accountability. One can be restored without the other. In this case, identity was the achievable outcome. The restoration of Deborah's name also changed how the case could be discussed publicly. Media coverage shifted from object-based language to person-centered reporting. Articles no longer led with the nickname, they led with her name. This change affects memory. Names anchor stories in a way that descriptions cannot. They allow for recognition, for connection, and for dignity. The case moved from being a curiosity defined by time to a human story defined by loss and recovery. The moment of identification did not erase the decades that preceded it. It did not undo the false closure or the years of dormancy. Those elements remain part of the case's history. What changed was the endpoint. Instead of concluding with uncertainty, the case could now conclude with recognition. The orange socks, once the most visible element of the case, receded into the background. They became what they had always been in reality. A detail, an object present at discovery, not a substitute for a name. This resolution did not arrive with ceremony. It was announced through official channels, confirmed through documentation, and absorbed gradually by those who followed the case. Its significance lies not in how it was delivered, but in what it corrected. For nearly 40 years, Deborah Louise Jackson had existed in records without an identity. The breakthrough of 2019 ended that condition. It did not answer every question, but it resolved the most fundamental one: who she was. That answer reshaped the entire narrative. It did not close the case in every sense, but it brought it out of anonymity. It allowed the story to be told with accuracy rather than approximation. In this chapter, the dual timelines converge. The life that began in Abilene and moved through Texas without complete documentation meets the investigation that began on a roadside near Georgetown. The space between those timelines remains, but the endpoints are now connected. The silent evidence did not speak loudly. It did not accuse or explain. It identified. And in doing so, it transformed the case. After identification, the case did not resolve itself into certainty. It settled into something quieter. The name Deborah Louise Jackson returned to the record, but many of the questions that had shaped the investigation remained unanswered. What changed was not the complexity of the case, but the way it could now be held. The place where Deborah was found has not changed. The stretch of land near Interstate 35 in Williamson County remains part of an ordinary landscape, shaped by traffic patterns rather than memory. There is no marker that explains why her body was there, or how she came to be discovered on that particular morning in October 1979. Environment offers no further explanation now than it did then. What has changed is the frame. For nearly 40 years, the case existed as an abstraction, an unidentified woman, a homicide without a name, a file defined by physical descriptions, and an object left behind. That abstraction allowed the case to persist, but it also limited how it could be understood. Without a name, the story remained incomplete by design. Restoring Deborah's identity corrected that imbalance. It did not fill every gap, but it anchored the case to a real person rather than a placeholder. The woman found near the roadside was no longer only the subject of an investigation. She was a daughter. She was someone who had grown up in Abilene. She was someone who had moved through Texas before disappearing from record. This shift matters even when outcomes remain uncertain. In criminal investigations, resolution is often measured by prosecution or conviction. In cold cases, particularly those involving unidentified victims, resolution can take a different form. Identification itself becomes a meaningful endpoint. It does not replace accountability, but it restores dignity. For Deborah's family, the identification ended a long period of not knowing. It did not answer every question about her final movements or her death. It did not explain why contact ended or how she came to be near Georgetown. What it did provide was confirmation. She had been found. Her fate, however incomplete in detail, was no longer unknown. That confirmation carries weight that is difficult to measure in investigative terms. It shifts uncertainty into a form that can be acknowledged rather than endured indefinitely. The absence that began when Deborah left home in the late 1970s no longer existed without explanation. The case also illustrates the limits of resolution. Even after identification, the homicide remains officially unresolved in a broader sense. The confession that once closed the case has been widely questioned. No alternative perpetrator has been publicly identified. The evidence does not support a definitive conclusion about responsibility. This unresolved element remains part of the record. Rather than framing this as failure, it is more accurate to see it as boundary. The facts establish what can be known and where certainty ends. Beyond that boundary, the case does not allow further reconstruction without speculation. Maintaining that boundary is essential to preserving the integrity of the story. The narrative of Orange Socks has always been shaped by silence. Silence in the disappearance timeline. Silence in the early investigation. Silence during the decades when the case lay dormant. Even the breakthrough arrived without drama, through methodical work rather than sudden revelation. That pattern continues here. The closing of this story is not marked by final answers, but by restored context. The orange socks remain part of the case. They exist in evidence records and photographs. They were present at the moment of discovery, and they shaped how the case was remembered for decades. Their role, however, has changed. They are no longer the name of the case. This transition is subtle but important. It reflects a shift from object-based memory to person-based remembrance. For years, the socks carried the weight of identification because nothing else could. Once Deborah's name was restored, that burden was lifted. The object did not lose its relevance. It lost its necessity. This distinction speaks to a broader pattern in forensic history. Many unidentified victims are remembered through fragments, clothing, jewelry, physical descriptions. These fragments become symbols, not because they define the person, but because they are all that remain accessible. When identity is restored, those symbols can return to their proper scale. In Deborah's case, The restoration of identity also reframes earlier investigative choices. The initial inability to identify her was not the result of negligence. It was shaped by the systems and limitations of the time. The false closure created by a confession reflects a period when standards for corroboration were different. Understanding these factors does not excuse error. It contextualizes it. The decades-long dormancy of the case illustrates another truth: preservation matters. The ability to identify Deborah in 2019 depended entirely on evidence collected in 1979 and maintained through years of inactivity. Without that preservation, the breakthrough would not have been possible. This outcome reinforces a lesson that extends beyond a single case. Even when investigations stall, maintaining records and evidence keeps the possibility of future resolution alive. Time alone does not solve cases. Preparation allows new tools to do so. The dual timeline that has structured this narrative now rests in a more stable alignment. Deborah's life and the investigation into her death no longer exist as parallel stories without intersection. They meet at a verified point of identification. What remains separate are the unanswered questions surrounding the homicide itself. Those questions persist, but they no longer define the entirety of the case. They exist alongside a restored identity rather than replacing it. This balance is important for how the case is remembered. It allows the story to conclude without forcing certainty where none exists. It respects the limits of the evidence while acknowledging what has been achieved. In public memory, the case may still be associated with its former nickname. That association reflects the long period during which no other reference was available. Over time, however, usage shifts. Names endure more reliably than descriptions. Deborah Louise Jackson now occupies that space. For listeners and readers encountering the case today, the narrative begins differently than it once did. It no longer opens with an unidentified body defined by clothing. It opens with a person whose identity was lost and later restored. This change does not rewrite history, it clarifies it. The absence of a confirmed disappearance timeline remains one of the case's defining features. That absence cannot be corrected retroactively. It remains part of the story's structure. Acknowledging it prevents the temptation to fill gaps with assumption. Similarly, the unresolved nature of the homicide remains intact. The case does not conclude with justice in the traditional sense. It concludes with recognition. That recognition has value independent of outcome. In many cold cases, identification is the only achievable form of resolution. It restores individuality to victims who have been reduced to case numbers or descriptors. It allows families to grieve with certainty rather than ambiguity. Deborah's case demonstrates this clearly. The return of her name did not change the past. It changed how the past could be held. The final reflection here is not about what remains unknown, but about what has been corrected. For nearly 40 years, Deborah Louise Jackson existed in records without a name. That condition has been reversed. The anonymity that defined the case for decades has ended. What remains is a story shaped by time, silence, and preservation. It is not a story of dramatic resolution or complete understanding. It is a story of limits respected and dignity restored. The road near Interstate 35 continues to carry traffic without pause. The systems that once failed to connect Deborah's life to her death have evolved. New cases will benefit from tools that did not exist in 1979. That progression does not undo the past, but it informs the future. As this narrative closes, the emphasis returns to the person rather than the case. Deborah Louise Jackson lived, moved through the world, and was lost from record for many years. She was found. She was identified. Her name has been restored. That outcome does not answer every question, but it answers the one that mattered most. Who she was,